Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us, and hope you're. How's the first day going? Good. Can I have a bit of energy? Woo! Yes. Well, look, he's made the right decision. Come back to the Q&A stage. We're going to kick it off with one of the most inspirational and best orators I've ever met in my life. Driving one of the most progressive, non-profit, progressive civil rights advocacy organizations in the world, but their focus is North America. They're driven by more than 7 million members working to build political and cultural power for black communities. Color Change is creating a more human and less hostile world for all people. Please welcome the president of Color of Change, Rashad Robinson. So guys, the beauty about this stage is we welcome world leaders to join and answer your questions, right? So the civil rights movements in all shapes and sizes in any countries is huge, it's pressing, and it always has been. But now we're looking to how we can make things progress for the better. So please do think about questions. No stupid questions here. Rashad is ready to answer any and all questions, okay? But I have a couple up my sleeve just to start. Welcome to Canada. I'm very curious, because I know that Color Change have a lot of focus in North America. Has there been much crossover with you in Canada?
When there's big moments that sort of reach sort of the world stage, our issues and our campaigns will regularly be covered on international news. I will do Canadian news every once in a while, and we regularly get outreach and engagement from folks wanting to be supportive and finding new ways, and sometimes from activists that want to collaborate or find ways to share strategies, to share techniques. And so that has been the sort of ways in which we've engaged. I do believe in sort of really being accountable as an organization to a constituency. And so that is why we focus very clearly in the US with a recognition that there are people in all different countries all around the world, in all different places, that are building and fighting and working to sort of move issues forward. And we want to respect that. And so, not trying to come in and tell other people how to fight for racial justice, but wanting to be in solidarity where it's appropriate.
Excellent. And Color Change have an ongoing campaign, Stop Hate for Profit. Can you maybe tell people a little bit more about that? How is the momentum going?
Yeah. So our Stop Hate for Profit campaign is very much focused on technology. We're in a space where we're talking a lot about technology, and the technology that has so much potential to move us into the future is dragging us into a past. And not because from an unfortunate perspective, but because of a whole set of incentive structures and design choices that have been made in terms of how technology has been designed, and also the rules of accountability from, I'll talk about the US, talk about the ways in which the accountability on these companies. And so as a result, when we think about misinformation and disinformation, when we think about sort of the ways in which the rise of white nationalism online, when we think about all of these sort of ways in which radicalization is happening online, and then we cross that with the choices these companies are making about what to amplify, about what to let travel, the opportunities these companies have around immunity. What we have done with Stop Hate for Profit is really focus on the enablers. We've spent a lot of time going at these companies, making demands of them. We've spent a lot of time going to congressional leaders and others working to push laws, and we'll continue to do all of that. And then there are the advertisers. There are those that show up and engage in these platforms. And we want to make sure that if a company puts their ads on a platform that then puts that ads right next to a white kind of appeal for white nationalism, they can't pretend like they didn't know. And this really does follow a long trajectory of work at Color of Change for years, where we have worked to hold institutions who are profiting off of hate accountable. You have a right to say whatever you want, but you can be held accountable for profiting off of it. And that is part of what we do. And so whether it has been the work years ago at the 2-year campaign that forced Glenn Beck off of Fox, which we led, the campaign that forced Bill O'Reilly off of Fox, which we led, the campaigns that forced Pat Buchanan off of MSNBC, which we led at Color of Change, all of these have been the type of campaigns that have gone to advertisers and say, don't come for our money by day and make us unsafe or advance hateful narratives about us at night. We will hold you accountable and we'll make you make a choice. And that has been part of the effort. And that only is possible when you can mobilize bases of people and then point people at strategic action, right? Because there's one thing to be outraged by what's happening, and there's another thing to be able to like give people something to do. And the quick story I'll tell about that is because this work is not just in the media space for us. And so after the election of Donald Trump, we started seeing a lot of rise of white nationalist organizations. Some of it was just targeting our organization for work that we were doing, and we had to deal with security and other issues. But when we started to research some of these white nationalist organizations and sort of how they were functioning, we would go on their website and you could put your credit card number in and make a donation. You could buy some of the most hateful paraphernalia that you would ever imagine right on their website. And we went to the credit card companies and said, you know, you shouldn't allow this to happen. And the credit card company said, oh, we don't agree with this, but you should go to the banks. And then the bank said, you should go to the credit card companies. And no one wanted to take blame for it. In fact, I had a journalist from the Washington Post call me up to say, as we had been building up this campaign, you know, Rashad, the banks really can't do anything about this. And so, you know, I don't know why you're making your demands on the banks. And I'm like, well, we were making them on the credit card companies. Like, well, the credit card companies really can't. So I'm like, no one can do anything about this, right? Like, somehow you can cut off funding for foreign terrorists, but not homegrown white terrorists. Like, explain this to me. And so, you know, we continue to build out this platform called No Blood Money. We went to the PayPals and the Amexes and the MasterCards of the world, and they, you know, continue to give us the runaround. And then Charlottesville happened. And I don't know how many people here saw what was happening in Charlottesville, where white supremacists and white nationalists descended on downtown with tiki torches. And that weekend, we launched our No Blood Money campaign. And we went back to these companies that told us there was nothing that they could do. And suddenly they were starting to send us lists of white nationalist groups that they were going to cut off from funding. Suddenly they could do something. No law had changed. Only the political dynamics and the infrastructure of people willing to take action. And so I say that to say that part of what we try to do is take the moments that exist where people want to take action and point people at action that can help make them more powerful and move things forward. Because in that moment, many people were on their social media pages complaining about what was happening, but what we were trying to do was cut these organizations off for money. And since the launch of that campaign, we've cut over 150 white nationalist organizations from being able to have donations profited through credit card and payment processing, so much so successful that one of the organizations reached out to us at Color of Change to try to explain to us why they weren't a white nationalist organization and to appeal to us for help because they weren't going to be able to pay their staff if our campaign kept going on. I asked them to say that one more time for the tape so that we could send it out and let people know how effective we were, and then asked them if they were going to take down the hateful, bloodied images of Muslim women that they had been posting on campuses, and they said no to that. And so we said no to any help to them.
Thank you for that. Guys, we're going to put questions out to the audience soon. I'm just going to ask another one here just on your take on the role of journalism and the present scene on the contemporary journalism. You have a current campaign, tell the media to stop perpetuating anti-black narratives. And that was specifically around COVID-19. But I wanted to kind of expand that beyond your perspective on contemporary journalism. Where do you think we stand today? And within that, is, say, for example, Twitter being taken over by Elon Musk, or maybe not, in comparison to, we had Jimmy Wales here, founder of Wikipedia, who is a completely decentralized platform, which is the other side. So just kind of the current situation, the Twitter situation, what's your kind of take on it all?
So I think this is really important because I think sometimes there can be a conversation that there was a good old days in journalism, right? When there was like a couple of networks and there were like white dudes on each of the channels telling us the perspective of what was happening, and that was the good old days because it was fact. And I want to say there were no good old days. There's only the future that we can hopefully help to build together that is more equitable across gender and race and religion and so many backgrounds. And so there has been so much work. And the importance of it, there's this great story in this book written by Juan Gonzalez and Joe Torres about the media, where they talk about Martin Luther King's office in downtown Los Angeles, and how there was a radio station above, and he was, in Atlanta, I'm heading to Los Angeles when I leave here. In Atlanta, and he would tap a broom on the ceiling, and when he wanted to sort of talk to folks, and they would lower a microphone down. And so media has always been a vehicle for us to be able to reach a broader audience. It's been a tool that has allowed people to be able to speak, sometimes filtered and sometimes unfiltered, to a broader audience. What we're dealing right now with amplification, algorithmic amplification, what we're dealing right now with sort of the profit incentives behind the biggest platforms that have sort of hollowed out local journalism in particular, where thousands upon thousands of local journalist outlets have closed over the last decade in the United States, and we end up sort of without the sort of infrastructure that can help people understand what's happening in their communities, help people become better citizens. That combined with sort of an infotainment that is oftentimes much more driven by clicks and likes and actual facts and substance. We're sort of in a really tricky climate in terms of what to believe and who to believe and how to actually make sense of the world around us. And COVID-19 exposed that in so many ways with all the misinformation and disinformation. But on an earlier panel, I also just talked about the premise of how we come to stories, the sort of ways in which stories are told about injustice and inequality. And far too often across the media space as a whole, stories about inequality are told as unfortunate, like a car accident. Like they just sort of happened. Like, not that they were manufactured through choices that were made, but they sort of just like, it's just an accident that women are less likely to get hired in big tech companies. And like, that's just like the way it is, and not really digging into the sort of ways in which those choices were made, manufacture inequality, not digging into maybe the data and seeing what things might look like for women of color. All of those things are sort of part of what good journalism could do and could be, but oftentimes the premise is wrong. And so, I used this example on an earlier panel where I said, we can see a story that says black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank as the headline. And we can see that, and that feels really benign. Or you can say banks are less likely to give loans to black people. And so both of those things probably, for us, kind of say the same thing. They're probably drawing on the same set of facts and data. But black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank. People start asking what's wrong with black people. How about we give black people financial literacy programs to help them deal with institutions which have targeted, exploited, redlined, and kept them out since the very beginning? If you say banks are less likely to give loans to black people, folks might say, what's wrong with the banks? Maybe we need reform of the banks. Maybe we need to do something with the banks. And so far too often we tell stories that are unfortunate rather than unjust. And when we tell stories about inequality that are unfortunate rather than unjust, we end up with charitable solutions to structural problems. And what I mean by that is people thinking that we can solve the Flint water crisis simply by sending water bottles, but not by making corporations pay their fair share of taxes so the pipes are actually clean. That we can solve problems with education by doing after-school mentorship programs rather than actually making sure education is fully funded. Charitable solutions to structural problems is the way that folks in power get out of actually making the type of real sort of systemic changes that changes how we move in this society and how we get to live in this society. And far too often, to your question, the current state of journalism is complicit in sort of not asking the questions that actually lead us to the structural problems, but asking questions that make people believe that charity will help us out of problems that are all about structures.
Amen. Thank you for that. Guys, hands up. Is there any questions in the audience? We got one here in the gentleman. Any other questions?
Hi, Rashad. Thank you for the talk. I have a question. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and we build amazing justice tech. How can startups like mine engage with and support the work that you all are doing?
Well, I mean, the best way is to, like, I guess, reach out. I mean, you know, every organization is complicated. Ours is always looking for people to engage with us in different places. We have a local organizing squad in the DC area, and so that's a way that volunteers come and engage with us. And then across our different program areas, we're constantly looking for partners. And so, you know, whether it's the work we're doing around holding corporations accountable or the work we're doing to hold government accountable. And so I would say, you know, reach out to us, engage. I'll be here for a little bit longer after this. And those are some of the ways in which sort of, you know, we work. I also just urge people to sign up with us. And if you sign up in your local, and you put your zip code if you live in the US, it will direct you towards local actions and local activities. And why are we not in Canada? It's because there are Canadians that need the support and the resources to be able to drive campaigns, and they need to be accountable to communities of color in Canada. And so the reason why we are not an international organization is because our charge is very US-based, and our sort of effort is to sort of work to build power. But in so many ways, the United States talks about issues all around the world, and I believe that if we can work to create more justice in the US, you know, at least we will be talking from a better space when we talk around the world.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes, we have a man here on the right. Thank you.
So you mentioned charitable solutions to systemic problems. I actually work in international development, so I see a lot of charitable solutions globally to very clear problems that were caused by colonialization and slavery and many of the things that are still occurring currently. And of course, I'm also African American and I live in DC as well. So we know the story there. One of the things that I have always grappled with is that I think the reason why there is such a focus on charity is because it does not change the power dynamic. It maintains the power dynamic. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on that?
You know, I mean, this is at the heart of activism. It's at the heart of sort of color of change in many ways, is rule change, right? And so Color of Change was founded about 17 years ago in the aftermath of a flood, Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina was a flood caused by bad decision makers that turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. It was a flood that I don't know how many people remember it, but black people were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. And the thing about Katrina and the thing about other moments like that is they illustrate things that people already knew, that we've already had lots of writing about, documentaries about, right? In the case of Katrina, it was geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to the planet, all the ways in which structural racism undergirds that. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing black people. Government, corporations, and media. And so to the point of your question around how do we actually deal with moving from charity to structural change, moving from charity to structural change is going to actually require people in motion and action holding leaders accountable. Because if those in power are not nervous about disappointing us, it doesn't matter. Color of Change was founded with a single email to about 1,000 people and now has grown into a movement of black folks and allies of every race. Over 7 million people have taken action with us just in the last year and a half. And those actions have led to all sorts of campaigns that have focused at holding corporations and government accountable. But we operate from this framework of not mistaking presence for power. presence is visibility, awareness, retweets, shout outs from the stage. It is sort of really connected to charity. I want to feel really bad about those people, so I want to help them. And it's not necessarily bad, right? Not always from a bad place. But if we just stay in that place and we don't actually build power, then we're not working to change the rules. We don't actually make things any better sort of long term. And so we work to channel presence into power. Because when you mistake presence for power, you think you've done something that you haven't done. So in the United States, you can think that a black president means that we're post-racial. You can think that America's love and celebration of black celebrities, I know that Beyonce just dropped a song last night, and people can think that that means that America actually loves black people as much as America loves black culture. And America can love, celebrate, and monetize black culture and hate black people at the same time, and those two things don't actually have to be in conflict. They can actually work and operate quite nicely together. And so part of this idea about what do we actually do to raise the floor on what's acceptable and push up the ceiling on what's possible is that we have to change the rules. And sometimes they're the written rules of policy, and sometimes they're the unwritten rules of culture. But the rules dictate how we get to engage in the world, and they also help to unleash us all, right? Because I fundamentally believe that when we actually work to end oppression for oppressed groups, we open up more possibilities for all of us. Victories that feminists win just don't help little girls dream bigger dreams, but they help little boys dream bigger dreams as well. And if we can see ourselves not in a zero-sum game about sort of what does it mean to win more victories, but see ourselves as connected and seeing society flourish, then we actually win bigger and better together, but we also make for the technology we build, the media we leverage, the stories we tell to be all the more richer and more impactful.
A round of applause for that, please. Any more questions in the audience? Any hands? We got one over here. Thank you.
Hi there. You mentioned local news media closing. It's the same thing has happened here in Canada. We've lost many, many local news media outlets. Have you thought about ways to rebuild that? I like that thought that, you know what, there was no golden era. It's interesting. I never thought about it that way. And how would we build it up? Because I think it's important. I feel like right now there's this vacuum in terms of the truth. And there's so many places where you can get information, but the truth is elusive.
Yeah, I mean, this is really tricky. I mean, this is why I think the rules are so important, that I do think that we actually need new rules for tech. There has to be new accountability. There has to be antitrust laws. There have to be things that actually deal with the outside's power and the immunity that these platforms have, if we're actually going to get to a place where we can build the type of strong networks that allow us to sort of leverage the truth. I mean, we at Color of Change won a victory with Facebook where we forced them to conduct a civil rights audit. And it was part of the larger sort of work we did around Stop Hate for Profit. And we won a civil rights audit. And we won actually a number of policy changes, like meetings with Mark Zuckerberg, meetings with Sheryl Sandberg, going back and forth. They hired a PR firm at one point to launch attacks on us. And we only found out because the New York Times exposed it. And I'm just, in a taxi going to a meeting, and the New York Times calls to say, what is your comment on Facebook hiring a PR firm to attack you and your organization? And I thought it was a joke at first, and then realized, well, maybe this isn't a joke, and didn't want to give a comment until I got it clear. We're not going to be able to fix that stuff just by protest. We actually have to fix that by new laws, by new accountability, by new rules. And this is what I want to say about that, is that our cars are not safe because of the benevolence of the auto industry. They are safe because there's accountability and there's infrastructure and there are rules. You go into a supermarket and you're not just having spoiled meat next to quality meat because big agriculture has decided that they want to make sure everyone is safe and screw profits. There's accountability and there's consequences. And so right now we're in this space where we hear from tech companies, well, it's about consumer choice. And that would be like going into a supermarket and you have a bunch of food that you can eat and some food that will make you sick. And they're saying, well, it's all consumer choice. And so until we deal with the rules, we're going to be in this place. The final thing I just want to say about activism as it relates in general, because I see a multiracial group of people, and I want us to all see ourselves in this story of the future. All see ourselves in the space of believing something new is possible and believing we can be part of that story. And so 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, we are all going to have a story of this moment, a story of the moments we're in. Maybe we will all be wearing masks again. Maybe some of us will be wearing masks. Maybe we will be talking about various sort of ways in which changes happened and changes didn't happen. But we will all have a story of that moment. And so I just want us, each and every one of us, to think about the character we want to be in that story. Who do you want to be in the story of the future? Who do you want people, how do you want people to describe you and your engagement and your efforts in this moment where change is possible, but there are so many forces standing in the way of it? And that, I think, is the opportunity that we all have to write the story about whether or not we get to become the protagonists in how we get to be depicted.
Just adding on to that, thank you, Rashad. There's a lot of obviously technology creatives in the room here, a lot of design creatives, all kinds, right? What are the kind of questions they should be asking themselves in light of the kind of topic we're talking about here?
So a couple of things. So the first thing I think that you should ask is, when there's a new tool coming to market, where has this been tested? Who has this been tested on? Who has been in the room as it's been created? I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, we were going back and forth with Zoom and about all the Zoom bombings that were happening across, Black groups, Jewish groups, Muslim groups, women groups, LGBT organizations. People were convening and their gatherings were being bombed. And so, and disrupted with all sorts of things that became destabilizing for these organizations that were already trying to come together during really challenging times. And when we talked to senior leadership at Zoom, they were like, well, we never imagined that anybody would want to disrupt someone's gathering. And I was like, well, that's a result of who you had in the room when you built this. That's a result of the table that you set and the choices that were made. And so you have, made some choices about qualifications, of expertise, of the type of knowledge that you need at the table, and you discounted some things that would have actually probably helped you ask the right questions. I also think that the right companies, the companies that are really going to be on the forefront, are going to be the companies that are actually thinking through and asking for the type of meaningful regulation that will not only make their companies thrive, but will allow them to stay in right relationship with the world. I think about all of the innovation that has come through the climate justice movements for cars and other tools, where we ended up getting tools in our homes or tools that we get to use that are not only safer, but operate well. And so there is innovation in safety. There is innovation in equity. And I think that the questions that people need to be asking is, who's at the table? What are the rules? And how do we sort of advance rules that actually sort of account for equity, but also spur innovation that can allow us? Because the challenge that we're dealing with now, not just in the US, not just in Canada, not just around the world, is that the idea of a multiracial democracy is an experiment. My board chair, Heather McGhee, whose book, The Sum of Us, was on the New York Times bestseller list this past year, talks about the US as a home of ancestral strangers, people that come from all different places to kind of work together and live together. And I think about that here in Canada, too. I think about that in so many places where people are strangers in so many ways from their backgrounds, their heritage, and they're trying to form a path forward, to share power, to work together, to operate on land that was stolen, to make reparations and amends for the harms that were caused, to be able to figure out a path forward. And so the questions that you should be asking if you're in these rooms building technologies is, how are the tools that I'm making going to help us be better as a society versus how is it going to just make me money?
Excellent. I have very good news for the audience as well. It's a question I've asked Rashad a couple of times over the last few years, is when is he going to write a book? And there's some wonderful news that there's a book on the way. So I'd love you just, if it's all right, to divulge a little bit about what's going on, what's going to happen, and when can we expect it?
I am writing a book with One World at Penguin Random House, and trying to get it done by the end of this year. And the book is titled From Presence to Power, a Blueprint for Social Change. And the book really does look at frameworks that I've developed over the last 15 to 20 years of activism. I used to say that, and people are like, you don't look old enough. But now, since the pandemic, they're like, oh yeah, maybe 30 years, right, Rashad? And but the last like 15 to 20 years of work, and really a set of frameworks that really help us think about power, help us think about narrative and culture, and all of these sort of ways in which we can move forward, and then also look at the power centers that shape our society, and how do we apply the sort of rules of advocacy, power, of race, to the places where so many decisions are made, whether it's government, whether it's Hollywood and culture, whether it's Silicon Valley, whether it's corporations in Wall Street, all the places by which decisions are made that impact the way we get to live. How do we work to build the type of power that changes the rules, and how do we undo the ways in which inequality is far too often talked about as unfortunate rather than unjust?
Ladies and gentlemen, please give Rashad a round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rashad.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
You can go stage left there. Thank you all for your time. Next up, we have climate justice activists. So staying on the theme of activism, but now going in towards climate change. It's with Sophia Kiani. Bear with us. Thank you.